Yeah, Andy and Maria, whenever you're ready.
I'm ready, but Maria isn't, and I think we should wait until Maria comes back.
I don't think we have much choice.
I'm here. I'm here.
Maria.
I was just with my camera off, so
No,
I can, let me get my presentation.
I'll take 30 seconds or so, just introducing you, Maria, if that's
Sure.
Would that be enough time?
Whatever you guys have planned.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm delighted that we've got Maria Esperanza Casullo speaking as a keynote here. She's recently published a book in Spanish whose English translation is Why Does Populism Work? Crafting Persuasive Explanations in Uncertain Times. And I know from conversations with Maria, she's been trying to get this translated into English, and it could well be coming out through Routledge. But she's got some recent articles in the journal Deliberative Theory, and also in a new collection coming out, edited by Pierre Osterguy, Benjamin Moffat, and Francisco Panizza, which is called Populism and Identification and Global Perspective. And we are the populism specialist group of the PSA. The PSA is often translated as the Political Science Association, but of course it's called the Political Studies Association, and I would probably characterize Maria's work, and I don't know if she likes this or not, but I'm going to do it anyway, as working within political narrative, effectively. And she explains concepts really, really lucidly, so I'm looking forward to what's about to come. And Maria's going to speak about populism and myth, I think, but over to you, and thank you.
Okay, thanks very much to Emmy and Andy for this wonderful workshop, for inviting me to speak to you all. And I also want to thank the Political Studies Association group on populism. I first got into contact with the group in 2017, I think, when I went to the Glasgow PSA conference, and it was, I want to emphasize that it was a very important moment for me. I did my dissertation in Georgetown University in the US, and I always tell the story that in the year 2006, when I told my advisor that I wanted to do my dissertation on populism, he said, I think it's fine, but I feel it's my professional duty to warn you that populism is a completely marginal topic to American mainstream political science. So it was truly wonderful to be able to sort of get in touch with a much wider and much more diverse community of scholars thinking in populism in a way that it's closer to my own heart, shall we say. And what I'm about to present today is it's based on my book, which it's called in Spanish, ¿Por qué funciona el populismo? What would be translated in English as Why Populism Works. And I published this book in 2009, working on presidential discourses, and the book had a very good reception, and I'm very happy about it. And I think one of the reasons why is this so is because the book is based on a very simple premise or question, which is, why are populist governments so resilient? If you look at the wave of populism study of populist presidents in South America, which is my primary focus of interest, they were all able to govern for 10 years or more, which in Latin American politics it's like dog years. It's roughly the equivalent of 1,000 years. And you get this paradox in which nobody likes populism, and yet populist presidents are tremendously resilient. Like we were discussing in the panel before, nobody wants to be called a populist, and yet if you act like a populist, it's very probable that you will be able to govern quite effectively if you define effectively as not being kicked out of government. And this also happened in the US, and I remember when Donald Trump won, many American friends told me, oh, he's not going to last more than a year, he's going to be impeached, he's going to go into a tremendous crisis. And I think you're surprised that populist presidents, when they won office, are more efficient than people tend to think. Now, there's one example in the South American case, which is Fernando Lugo, which I will discuss briefly because I think it's a wonderful counterexample to this thing that I'm saying. So one thing that when I was doing discourse analysis and analyzing discourses by American presidents and working quite inductively, one thing that really struck my mind is that populists all speak in a very similar way. And they speak in what I called the populist myth. As Andy was saying, they speak in narrative terms. Granted, the term populist myth, I took it from Margaret Canavan, but Margaret Canavan in his book, The People, just mentions it in passing, doesn't do a lot with it, but it was really striking to me how the notion of a genre called myth is truly central for populist discourse. To this day, I found this template, this narrative template, to be underpinning the discourses of pretty much all the populist politicians that I've studied. And the myth is, it's a story. The myth is very much like a childhood folk tale. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it tells a set of adventures. And of course, like in every folk tale, the center of the story is a hero. And the hero, of course, wants something, but is impeded to get to where the hero is. And it's starting from a position of being downtrodden. So the populist myth is going to be the story of how a downtrodden, hurting hero is about to mobilize itself, go into a moral and epic quest and reclaim its destiny. Now, of course, as any parent that has watched countless Disney animated movies knows, the real key to any narrative story is who's the villain. It's more important that you have an interesting villain than you have an interesting hero. And the heart of the populist myth is the declamation, the denotation of who is the villain. And then, and this is a notion that I take from Julio Aybar, is the other central issue is the damage. The villain has damaged the hero in some way. And the populist movement is about overcoming that damage, punishing the hero, the villain, and reclaiming the proper role for the hero. Now, and of course, the hero is the people, right? But it's a collective hero, it's not an individual hero. But the other interesting thing that I figured out when I was studying the discourses is that the hero is always dual, always dual. It's the leader and the people together. And this is one key difference, for example, if we think about the populist definition of the people, as opposed to, say, the Marxist or socialist definition of the working class. the people is the hero, but the people, because of a lot of reasons, cannot do it on its own. It needs a leader, but the leader is not about bossing the people around. It's more like a servant and the redeemer of the people. That's why I think the notion of redeemer is so central. And I think it's very common to talk about left and right-wing populism. I'm not satisfied with this distinction, so I think there is much to be said about different types of populism and the geographical distribution of these types of populism, and the fact that in South America we have more sort of a status distributive populism in the US and Europe. Now you have this kind of nativist populism. But in my way of thinking, I prefer to talk about upwards punching populism and downward punching populism. Because the difference between these populisms is not whether one has like a perfect set of programmatic left policies and the other one has a perfect set of right-wing policies, but who are they fighting with? How they define the direction of the antagonism. And in one case, in the South American pink wave of the early 2000s, it was very clear that the villain that they defined was the financial and economic, like the wealthy, powerful sectors of society. But the interesting thing is that the villain is always also dual. It's a binary villain in which you have an external entity. In the South American upward punching populism, it's usually American empire, and but they are allied with the internal villain, which is always defined as a traitor. And this is the key antagonism here. The fact that there is a part of your community, your collective, that should be part of the people, and yet they have chosen to be allied with the foreign threat. And then they become a moral antagonist. The antagonism is defined in moral terms more than in just ideological terms. The traitor in the upwards punching populism is the social elite, the political casta, bankers, economists. There are many different ways that they can be defined. And the struggle of the movement is about recognition and redistribution, to be recognized as a legitimate people and to get resources from the traitors, from the villains, and give them back to the rightful owners, which are the popular classes. In downward punching populism, you get this interesting effect. And I think that's one of the reasons why right-wing punching populism is kind of a little bit hard to research, because you still have the dual hero where you have the authentic people. And I know we had a paper yesterday on authenticity. The people is defined as authentic people, as a people that was constructed organically in the past and whose wholesomeness and authenticity needs to be defended in a way that upward punching populism does not. The people of upward punching populism is not something that is completed in the past. It's something that needs to be completed in the future. Now the villain is different, because the villain is usually defined as an external entity that is threatening the authenticity of the people. And it's usually actually not the rich and wealthy and powerful parts of society, but it's actually quite excluded vulnerable groups, such as immigrants, Latin American immigrants, people of Muslim faith, feminists. So how can you explain this? You know, we all repeat that populism has an anti-elite discourse, but if you look at downward punching populism, those groups do not really look like they're part of the elite. Now, the key is that the traitor that these populisms define are the cultural elites. So it's basically us. It's professors who choose to defend and speak for and ally themselves with feminists and women and LGBTQ groups and immigrants. And we are defined, cultural Marxism or academic elites or whatever are defined as the traitors in this idea. And the struggle is to keep the barbarians out, basically. It's the movement is not so much about achieving meaningful redistribution, but to be able to close the boundaries or who is defined as a meaningful part of the people. And just to give a couple of examples, this is a phrase from the former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, in the year 2018, speaking to the UN, said, to free ourselves, it has been important to identify the internal enemy and the external enemy, not only of the indigenous movement, but to all the people. So you have here quite clear the idea that you have the external movement, which is neoliberalism and American imperialism, but the key player is the internal enemy, which is the colonial structures of the colonial Bolivian state that are working in tandem with this foreign interests. Now, it's kind of funny because I wrote this presentation 2 days ago and I put in right-wing populism, the key idea is keeping the barbarian out, and then it turns out that Marine Le Pen gave a speech just 2 days ago saying, real barbarism is taking hold. With barbarism, we do not negotiate, we fight it. So you have this notion that the threat is something that it's completely alien to you, and it's coming from outside, and you need to protect sort of like the fortress from this alien threat. Now, the key notion, and I think there are two issues why to speak in populist language is so effective politically in today's society. The first one is that the identification is personalized. You're asking a lot of people not to identify with a program, not to identify with an ideology, not to identify with a given set of particular policies. You're asking them to identify with a person. And we know from Max Weber on that this sort of identification is very powerful. And this also connects to the second issue, which is that you also personalize the villain. The villain, the antagonism, has a face, it has a name, and it has is a person or a group of persons. So it's much more comprehensible to the regular people, shall we say. When they're hurting, when there's a feeling that they're being damaged by injustice, the explanation to this feeling of hurt is no, oh, we have this abstract process that breaks down and we need to find a solution, is this person's fault. You have these powerful people that is on purpose trying to hurt you, and we need to mobilize against them. And there are two examples here. I'm going to give a very brief set of examples based on Argentine Kirchnerism. One is this man here is the owner of the most important Argentine newspaper. His name is Héctor Magneto, and he was directly defined as one of the adversaries of the Kirchner's government. And every Argentine person suddenly got to know his name. And this is Judge Thomas Grisa. He was the one judge in New York, and he was involved in a very high-profile Vulture Fund trial against the Argentine state. And the key to this is that by personalizing antagonism, first of all, you, as I said, you channel the energy of the mobilization towards a concrete goal, but it's also, and this, I think this is the key notion, the myths are almost infinitely malleable. You can adapt them, they are a template that can be adapted and that can be filled with an almost infinite permutation of combinations of who's the hero, who's the villain, who's to blame, and who shall we follow. And it can be adapted almost day to day to the needs, shall we say, of the leader and the movement in that particular moment in time. And this creates a flexibility of antagonism that I think if you look at most programmatic left-wing parties today, they just lack. Because they have a much more complicated and complex and well-developed set of programmatic diagnosis and a framework of analysis. They are much more locked in the sense of who are they fighting with. And they also tend to speak in much more abstract and technical terms. While populist governments are able to change, it's like a boxer who changes from foot to foot and keeps on changing who the adversary is. And for example, if you look at Argentine Kirchnerism, which was a very successful government in this limited sense, that they were able to govern for 12 years. They were the longest governing cycle in Argentine history, except for, President Roca, but I think they were longer than that. If you look at the year 2004, and it's, of course, they came to power after a very the deepest economic crisis in Argentine history, when a lot of people were hurting, where there was almost 50% people either unemployed or with severe employment problems, 50% poverty, etc., etc. And in the first phase of the government, the villain was the IMF and Argentine's economies that had worked for the neoliberal governments of the 90s. This is President Kirchner going to his first mass rally in a very popular poor neighborhood of the outskirts of Buenos Aires. And for 2 or 3 years, the whole discourse was geared towards defending the government's policies as against the IMF and the economies, which were, of course, by the time reviled by Argentine society. In 2005, there was another antagonism which was defined as no al alfa, or the opposition to the free trade agreement that President George W. Bush was trying to advance for the region. And this photo was taken in the American summit in Mar del Plata in Argentina, where presidents of South America finally said, we are not going to sign the trade agreement with the US. And there was a whole process of mobilization against this, behind this slogan of no al alca. And of course, this was done in tandem with Lula da Silva, with Hugo Chavez at that moment. Now, in 2008, the situation changed completely, and there was a very high profile conflict with soybean exporters in Argentina, and that rearranged the political field in Argentina completely. And then the government moved from fighting an adversary who was outside of the government, the IMF and the vulture funds, to fighting an adversary that was inside, that was a part of Argentine society, that were all the interests related to the agricultural exporters of Argentina. And this went on for almost a year. And this brought in a whole new set of alliances. And of course, in the year 2009, the adversary changed towards big media, and especially the owner of the Clarín group of media conglomerate. And this is, if you look at this, I have a little bit of time. So this is a graffiti painted in somewhere in Buenos Aires. And this is Cristina Kirchner, who was then president, and she's wearing she's wearing black because at that time her husband, former President Kirchner, had died. She was a widow. So for almost 2 years, she only dressed in black to sort of remember everybody that her husband, who was at the time very popular, had died. And she is putting a portrait down, and this has to do with President Kirchner in 2004 had ordered the chief of the Argentine army to put the portraits of the Argentine dictatorship de facto presidents down. But the person who's in the portrait is Héctor Manieto. It's his face. So it's a very, and if you look at the slogan there, it says Ley de Medios. So this was a call for a new law for media banning conglomerates or trying to break down media conglomerates. So if you look at this, it's a very clear example of you have the personalization of the leader, who's Cristina, and you have the personalization of the adversary, who's Héctor Manieto. And in 2000, this changed back again in 2014 when the so-called vulture funds brought the Argentine state to trial because they wanted, vulture funds were funds that had bought the remnants of the Argentine bonds whose bondholders had not traded them in when Argentina restructured its foreign debt. And they brought those bonds to trial, requiring the Argentine state to pay those bonds in full and not in the reduced rate that Argentina was paying after the debt restructuring. But the interesting thing is that this is a super complicated, abstract process that is taking place in this trial in Manhattan and involves people whose names you don't even know, who bought these bonds that pretty much nobody in Argentina knows how the bond market operates. I have no idea. But the antagonism was very directly and very rapidly channeled towards the judge that was presiding over the bond trial. And this is another graffiti in which the face that you see this is Thomas Grisa. And the Argentine banner and a set of chains. And so you have your standard national liberation tropes here, and then it says liberación, liberation. So again, I think this is an interesting example of how it's always about putting a face towards the feelings of being wrongly, or being done wrong. And I think this is, if you look at, of course, this is not the only explanation, but if you look at, if you ask yourself, how was Kirchnerism able to govern for 12 years in a country like Argentina that has had repeated presidential crises, and that in the year 2001 had 5 presidents in the span of 2 weeks, literally, is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is that by changing the direction of the antagonism is was always directed upwards towards a group or a part of people that are rich and powerful. But by changing the face of who you're fighting with, you're able to not getting stuck in a given coalition and to refresh your coalition constantly. For example, by bringing youth groups, by bringing, in the year 2010, the that Kirchnerism passed an egalitarian marriage law. They legalized gay marriage, and they also brought new people in. And by doing that, they fought with the church, and then later they became friends with the Argentine church once Pope Francis got Pope. So you can be friends with almost anybody, or you can be an adversary with almost anybody, and you can change this. And this allows for a greater flexibility. So I think the key is that you have these three things. You have personalization, both of the identity of the in-group and the identity of the crowd group. You have flexibility of the personalization. And you have, and I think this is key, and this goes back to what we were discussing in the panels with Emmy yesterday, you have righteous anger. You have a narrative that says it is okay to be angry, we are all angry, and this is why we're angry. This discourse, this narrative, this political narrative, is able to contain and explain the feelings of anger and injustice in a way that makes sense to those that follow or believe this discourse. It's a discourse that doesn't tell the people you shouldn't be angry. It's a discourse that doesn't tell the people, oh, we need to approach this with a feeling of neutrality, right? Or we need to approach this with a technocratic mind and just decide what the best solution is. It's a type of discourse that says, we are angry, and it's okay to be angry because we have been damaged. And this is the person that has damaged us, and we need to politically mobilize in order to make that wrong, to make it right. And why shouldn't people be angry? I think that this goes back to, why do we believe that anger or any kind of emotion is a secondary emotion or something that needs to be put aside when you discuss politics? If you live in a country in which in 2 years has gone from 20% poverty to 50% poverty, why shouldn't people be angry, right? And if they are, they need to, it is important to them that somebody says, I know that you're angry, and this is the reason why you're angry. And not only that, but we're going to do something with that feeling of anger. And this creates an enormous amount of resilience for these political identities. I think this is another issue that political science has had a lot of trouble grappling with. We assume that populist identities and populist processes of identification are very brittle, that they are sort of a demagogical effect that is going to last just 5 minutes. And then it turns out that you have in South America today, this even now, where the left-wing populists or punching upwards populists have sort of moved out of government, Peronism continues to be the most important political identity in Argentina. The MAS in Bolivia continues to be a very big an identity. Correism in Ecuador continues to be an identity, etc., etc. These are not like fleeting impulses of identification. These are political identities that have the power to govern, and then once they are out of office, they can last for a long time. Because this type of explanation makes sense to the lived experiences of a lot of people. With one exception, and this is where I think I wanted to bring the example, as I do in my book, of Fernando Lugo. Fernando Lugo was the president of Paraguay, a former Catholic priest and bishop. And it's interesting because all these governments that I was discussing had very serious threats to their own power. Very serious governmental threats, very serious, they had very serious crises. Hugo Chavez had a coup d'etat in 2001, Evo Morales had almost the eastern provinces of Bolivia almost managed to succeed, to secede in 2006. Rafael Correa had a very serious crisis with the police and was sort of kidnapped by the police. And all these governments, and of course Kirchnerism had the Crisis del Campo in 2008, in which there was fears that the government was going to be pushed out of office. And they all managed to survive this crisis. They were more resilient than even their adversaries had to believe, with the exception of Fernando Lugo. Fernando Lugo he was impeached in 2012, and he was not able to survive the impeachment process. He was impeached and he was out of office in 48 hours. Now, the interesting thing about Lugo is that if you analyze his discourses and his self-presentation, there's no doubt in my mind that he was the less populist of the South American populists of the time. He did not choose, he never designated his adversaries by name. His discourse was much more technocratic than the rest of the South American presidents. There's this very interesting humbleness in his discourse, and there's the notion of like sacrifice. I remember there's one discourse in which he says, these are my political heroes, and my political heroes are just Jesus Christ and Gandhi, which are fine, but they both sort of had like martyrdom ends to their lives and their life projects. And more importantly, when it was announced that Lugo was going to be impeached, he did not call for mobilization of his followers. He probably couldn't have, that's another discussion, but he never said, I will mobilize. Unlike all the other South American populist presidents, which when they came into a crisis, the first thing they said is, we need to go into the street, you need to defend your president because your president is a key to your identity. And so there was no popular mobilization, and Lugo fell. Which really, in my mind, shows that moderation doesn't pay off, at least in South American context. You have all these sort of political scientists, analysts, journalists asking the South American populist president, you should become moderate, you should speak more like a regular technocratic politician. But if you are a president, I am really not sure that moderating your discourse has any political payoff. On the contrary, I think it's more important to keep on riding this myth and to keep on sort of fueling the antagonism, because this is the central connection between the leader and the people, and is what keeps the people mobilized and ready to be mobilized in the defense of the leader of the movement. So I think it is important to keep this in mind, that you read a lot of the analysis of the political scientist is not the analysis of the politician, right? It's what political science thinks that it's a good political discourse. It's not necessarily what the politicians are going to think that it's a good political discourse, or the followers. And I think that's another, and just wrapping this up, is I think that there is profound, I'm going to say this, happiness in being able to participate in a political movement that offers you the possibility to change the way things are. And I think this type of political narratives give people that are, as I said before, felt that they are the victims of an injustice and that they are damaged. They offer them the ability to go out and participate in something larger than themselves that is going to change the world, basically. And this is a very important and even life-transforming experience for people that participate in this type of movements. And I think that it's important that as political scientists, we recognize that a lot of people are mobilized by this type of discourse and that they enjoy, in a way, participate in these types of movements. Now, and again, going back to this notion of what is the proper way of doing politics, I think that it's important to recognize that myths are a primary political genre, that human beings speak about common affairs using narratives even before that they learn to speak about politics in political programs, that they are not a secondary or second best type of speaking about politics. They are completely primary, that every political community uses and deploys and tells themselves stories about who they are and where they come from and where are they going and who's part of the community and who's not a part of the community. And that they organize action, that they define an imagined community, and they create identity from heterogeneity. Probably the first myth that we read is the myth of metals in Plato's Republic. And that is the central question that any political community has to answer for itself, which is, why are we a we? Why are not we just a collection of isolated individuals? And this is done in a mythic sense before we move on to another type of language. Now, this creates a problem, and going back to the panel that we just heard, I found very interesting the discussion whether you can have a transnational populism or you can't have a transnational populism. That myths define the community, and they define a community in a bounded sense. You cannot have a truly universal community, right? If you use this type of discourse. This type of discourse creates a limit between a we and a they. And this limit is, it's always going to be there. There's no hope, like in the Marxist sense of a day of emancipation, in which the frontier between a they and an us is erased and we all become part of a larger universal. And of course, this creates a problem because I'm suspectful of the notion that you can have a truly transnational populism in this sense. And the other thing is that these types of myths, you have to work with local elements of who's the people, who are they angry with. It's always very time and place, it's context dependent. It's not, these kind of myths are not so easy to travel to other spaces and time. Now, in our particular political and social moment, I think the other thing that we are seeing is that the mythic language is more effective than the old programmatic ways of talking about politics. Because in the current situations of heightened social heterogeneity, where you have distinctions of class, of gender, of ethnicity, of regionalism, there are so many points in which identification can be created. And it's easier, or it's more effective to create a we by saying, okay, we all have these differences, but we have something in common that we're hurting. And we're hurting because our common adversary is making us hurt. So we need to move together. Let's put our differences aside and let's move together. And I think this way of creation identity from social heterogeneity is going to become even more prevalent in the current conditions of social fragmentation and social multiplication of points of identity. So to finish, really, populism is a perfectly rational strategy. There's no reason why any politician is going to reject populism out of hand. It's very effective to win elections. I think we've seen this all over the world. And it's also effective to keep the loyalty of your coalition once you govern, until you get to the problem of succession. And this is what we've seen at the end of the upward punching populism cycle in South America, that probably the Achilles heel of these movements is because the identification is done by the leader. The leader is the only speaker that has the performative authority to say who's inside the we and who's outside the we, and is directed to the leader. It's very hard to translate the identification and the role of the speaker to another person. And that's why succession, none of these governments, they were very resilient when they were in power. None of them could solve the problem of succession. But that's another story for another day. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maria. To everyone else, the first person who has a question, please just go ahead and speak. Thereafter, if you can just indicate in the chat.
Can I start then? Or...
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria, for this presentation. It's really wonderful. I have a few questions that I really wanted to ask. I just took notes. So the first one, and please forgive me if it's something that you clearly specified and I didn't understand, but because I use the word myth a lot, a narrative a lot in my research, I wonder if you could elaborate more about how you define myths and how does it differ from narrative? Do you understand a myth as an overarching narrative based around a hero, or is it about how it's understood? So that's maybe the first one. The second one is, I find the division of upward punching and downward punching populism very thought-provoking, but I wonder if, going back to Amy's point about the morality that is underpinning other similar distinctions like Ostigis, social cultural law, Moffitt's bad manners, I wonder if this distinction does not share similar limits or problems, that is distinguishing good, so upwards populism, from bad, downwards populism. And the last point is I'm very interested in your discussion of narrative, as I said, who are the good guys and the bad guys. And I presented a paper earlier this year at a conference on pop culture and politics, where I attempted to make parallels between the trope of the well-intentioned extremist, think of Thanos in the Marvel universe, Magneto for the X-Men, and how anti-populist discourse to show that the mechanism used to discredit these are similar, but framing them as incompetent, as evil. So my third question is, I would like your thoughts on not only this process of mythicizing or narrativizing oneself, but also the converse or corollary use of narratives by mainstream politicians, weaponize populism as a tool to discredit, to create a myth around the other, to discredit any form of radicality. Thank you very much.
We'll take a couple more questions, one from Daniela and then from Paris, and then if you can respond, please, Maria.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maria, for your presentation. I have two questions. First one, is the personalization of populism around the leader a characteristic of populism itself, or is it more a characteristic of Latin America's populism due to the lack of a strong party system? And second question, if we define populism if we define populism parties or populist oferta, Maria, I'm sorry, I lost the word. La oferta populista. If we define the oferta populista from the leader figure, how can we define the populist demand? Thank you.
Right.
Hi, Maria. Nice to see you.
Hi, Paris.
A question on identity. Is what you're describing, it's somewhat similar to what Daniela just said, it has to do with the presidential system in Latin America and how this influences our view on populism. But I'm more interested in the difference between populist identity and partisan identity. I mean, are you talking about populist identity really? I mean, the Peronist identity, you switched in your conference from talking about populist identity to Peronist identity. Isn't that a partisan identity? I mean, is it entirely correct to keep the word populism relevant in this case? It works in other countries too, like in the US. I mean, there's a Republican identity and a Democratic identity. If you're born in one of them, you probably keep voting for the same party all your life. And that don't people who are not populist do the same thing more or less, you know, focusing on specific individuals? Like liberals today would focus on Trump as the enemy, or you know, in Western Europe they might focus on Marine Le Pen as the enemy. And even in a positive way, you remember the Macron mania, for instance. So liberals themselves sometimes, if we consider liberals to be the ultimate anti-populists in a way, they also have this need to embrace an individual as a leader sometimes and attach their ideology sometimes to that leader specifically. Merkel could be another case here. Thank you.
Should I go? Okay, so the notion of myth, I think myth is a type of narrative. I think it's important a myth is a narrative, but not a narrative are myths in my understanding. Narratives, you have legends, you have folk tales, and they share a similar structure, but I just took the definition of myth out of very simple, you know, anthropology. Myth is a narrative that a community tells itself about its origin and why they are a community and not just a set of individuals. So myths and the difference is that myths are A, collective, and B, are supposed to have an element of truth in them. They are not just tales, right? They are told, of course, nobody says that they are perfect truth, but they are told to, you know, they have a kernel of truth. They are truth and false at the same time, no? But they are not told just from the literary component of them. The distinction between upwards and punching, if it's a normative distinction, maybe I'm being overly normative. That wasn't I'm going to think about it. That wasn't my intention. Really, it was just trying, maybe I need to change those two words, but I was just trying, there was two sources of discomfort for me. First of all, I wasn't comfortable with speaking about left populism or right populism, because once you start looking at what these governments do, left populisms can at times do shockingly right-wing things, and even right-wing populisms at times can do things that you would think that they are part of a typical left part. And also, I don't like the distinction between inclusive and exclusive populism, for example, because I think that all populisms are inclusive and all populisms are exclusive. They include groups and people in their identity, but they all designate somebody as the antagonist. So no populism is perfectly inclusive or perfectly exclusive. And I was also very uncomfortable with the idea that all populism that populism is based on anti-elite discourse. Because it's hard for me to say that Donald Trump's main antagonism during this campaign, who were Latin American and Mexican immigrants, are part of the elite. I don't think you can say that. It's not the same to say that the elite are Mexican immigrants and to say that the elite are landowners in the South American case. So I was just trying to come up with a better terminology, that it's neither inclusive or exclusive or left-right or just simply anti-elite. Now, of course, this gets complicated, as you were saying, because the anti-populism now is in itself a kind of mythical discourse in which the source of all evil are populists. And I think we were discussing this briefly yesterday when we were discussing the role of emotions and rationality in politics, and it turns out that almost all anti-populists decry populism as irrational, but of course, when they decry populism as irrational, they are speaking from a profoundly emotionally charged place. They are not utilizing neutral language. They are using the language of moral condemnation against populism. So in a way, I think you can see now the formation of an anti-populist populist myth, if that makes any sense. Actually, in my book, I have the final chapter is about Mauricio Macri, the Argentine president who defeated Kirchnerism and Peronism. And you can see this very clearly in a way in which the main Macri's campaign theme was the anti-populist discourse, and this was one of the key of his successes. Now, the personalization around the leader. This is a very charged, every time I discuss with colleagues that do research on the European context, they bring about this criticism because they say, okay, this is an American, Latin American, and North American topics because it has to do with the presidential system, while in Europe, when we talk about populists, we tend to speak much more in terms of populist parties. And I think that's completely, I take the criticism, but even in this sense, even in this context, I really believe that even in the context of well-established populist parties, the leaders or the faces of those parties become focal points of interest in the formation of those identities. So you still have Marine Le Pen, you still have Wilders, you still have Orban, you still have the Austrian former prime minister. It's very, I don't know if I can think of a populist party that is completely faceless, right? Faces and the ways in which the identity is articulated in the words of the leaders, to me, are continue to be important. But I take, again, for example, another point of discussion that I had with Cristóbal Rovira a couple years ago is whether movements such as Occupy Wall Street or the Indignados should be considered populist movements. And in my view, they should not, because they don't have a face, a recognizable face. But there's a lot of people who disagree with me, and this is, and I take this. What has to do with populist demand? I think that the first, and also this is an important issue with populism. I think that there's a notion that there is a demand, right? And I think that if these movements become so powerful in a way, if they are able to achieve political saliency, it's because they meet a demand, right? But that demand has a component, that demand before, it's not so much a demand about particular material things, it's a demand about recognition, right? It's a demand about and recognition of your senses of anger and betrayal and injustice, and having those feelings be put into words and be explained in a narrative that makes sense. And I think, you know, this happens many times, I think, with some more center left parties or politicians that they offer, in a way, they say, okay, we're going to give these things, you know, redistribution, taxation, but they don't offer this kind of language that recognizes not only the goods, but the formation of a people. So I'm going to be more forceful. I think there is a demand to be formed into a people, to be formed into a collective, to be given a language in which a sense of grievance and identity and mobilization can be explained. Even in the relative absence or in the imperfect nature of the redistributive agreements. And this brings me to identity, and I think this is a very good question about, you know, okay, you talk about the leader, but then you speak about Peronism, and it's completely, I understand that criticism completely, but what I'm going to say is this: it's not so much that the leader, first of all these leaders, and this is in another chapter that we published from my friend Flavia Freidenberg. All these leaders, it doesn't mean that the institutional dimension exists, and it's very important. And you can see that all these leaders did tremendous amounts of efforts and resources into party building, right? And party building really pays off. I mean, if you're able to develop, to institutionalize parts of this identity into party institutions, this is useful and important. And you can see this in Peronism, which is actually, it's been around for 70 years in Argentina and has won, I don't know, 5 presidential elections or more, or 6. But what I'm going to say is not so much that the leader can operate within a party system, but any Peronist that wants to become president needs to learn to speak like this, right? You need to, and you need to become the speaker you need to become fluent in mythical language. And what about liberal individuals? Isn't that the same? Isn't that Merkel a source of identification? I cannot really answer that question. I haven't done research on that, but quite frankly, I do not think that Merkel operates to the voters of the Christian Democratic of her own party in the same way that Le Pen or Trump or operates. I don't like for the voters of a Peronist president or Trump. This is a complicated issue. And of course the coexistence of this type of language and leadership and party structures. And also it's very different. Another thing that I didn't mention is that this type of mythical structures, of course, works much better when you're in the opposition than when you're in government. And the longer you're in government, the more difficult it is to convince everybody that you're the underdog, right? So you get these cycles in which these populist movements win and they govern, and then they lose, quite frankly. But I still believe that there's a part of contemporary politics that can be and should be explained with these categories.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions from Lazaros and Carola. If you two can pose those, and if Maria can respond, and if anyone has a question from the audience, please do notify.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Maria, for this really nice and informative presentation. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna limit myself to only one. I want to go back to the beginning of the presentation where you mentioned the hero and the villain. And my question is based on, are we talking actually about the hero redeemer, or is that figure sort of a reminiscence of possibly an emancipatory past. I mean, I will be more specific. You had the picture of Chavez, and there has been a connection, from my limited knowledge, there has been a connection with Bolivar, and that Chavez has this appeal that can extend outside of Venezuela. And if we see something respective on the case of the villain, for example, because you mentioned the personification of the villain into one figure, maybe this happens also in a way that this figure acts as reminding us of a past, of that there is a history behind this figure, or a history of an oppressive system, of certain oligarchic tendencies, for example, that this person represents and stuff. I hope I made myself clear. If not, I can clarify something. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. I very much agree that myth and narratives are in the core of politics, and I had a question about that because the myth that you described, the populist myth, is based on an antagonism between the enemy of the people and the people, together with the populist. But you also argue that this is a very powerful myth, and I agree with that. But my question is, are there other types of myth that are not populist, that are maybe as powerful, or do you think that are always less powerful? For instance, Obama also used myth, and he's talking about challenge for the whole society and all people working together to make the world better. Or you can look at the Disney movies about superheroes, in which powerful heroes not belonging to the people save the people. And how do you think about using that myth in politics? Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for the very insightful questions. One thing that I discuss in my book, but I didn't present now because of the time constraints, is that another part of the myth is a tradition. Every one of these presidents situates himself or herself in a tradition, which of course is created, it's retrospectively created. So I said before that myths are true and false at the same time. And this is one of the instances in which I think this true and false category is useful. That every one of these presidents articulates all the time. First of all, they talk a lot. One of the things that define a populist is that they talk forever, right? And why? And because they need to articulate and re-articulate and explain and re-explain the myth constantly, especially because the myth is changing. So once you are, Peronism was very much against gender claims and LGBTQ historically. And then in 2010, Peronism embraced them. And this came to a shock to people. So these things had to be explained and re-explained. And one of the things that has to be explained or re-explained is the tradition. All of these presidents situate themselves in a tradition that they create, or they create in a hybrid manner, mixing and matching elements from Argentine past, US past, French past, in a very creative and non-truthful way, in a way, but in a very truthful and authentic way, in another way. So you have Chavez using Bolivar, and you have, for example, I will give a very short example. The human rights struggle and the human rights organization became central to the Kirchnerist identity in Argentina. And Kirchner and his wife, and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, always said, we are part of the Abuelas and Madres de Plaza de Mayo. We come from the generation that was that our friends became the desaparecidos in the 70s. And then a lot of people said this is false. The Kirchner did not have a lot of work in the human rights organization in the 70s. And both things are true. It is true because they embraced that tradition and they passed laws towards that end. And it's also kind of false because it's also true that maybe in the 70s they were not central to their identity. So you have this very complex and very hybrid and mix and match selective processes of creating a tradition. And this is one of the reasons why I think about a truly transnational populism is difficult, because each of these persons situates themselves in a point in time that they create a thread to the past and a perspective to the future that is quite uniquely constructed with elements from that particular cultural context. Which brings me to the other question. Are there other political myths? Yes, completely. And also I talk about this a little bit in my book. You can think, and I was, of course, in saying this, I was inspired by François Lyotard's notion of meta-narrative, of political meta-narratives. You can think that there's a liberal myth in which the hero is the free individual and the villain is the state. You can think that there's a more Marxist myth in which the hero is the working class and the villain is sort of the bourgeoisie. But, for example, the Marxist myth, the villain is not really an immoral villain. It's not a choice. It's a historical necessity that needs to be overcome. While in the populist myth, the traitor becomes traitor by choice. They should be and could be aligned with the people, but they chose to work against the people. So it's different type of antagonism. And in this case, you know, and the hero is always dual in the populist. And that's another thing that really struck me when I was doing the discourse analysis, that a lot of the criticisms of populism focus, they focus on the authoritarian characteristics of the leader. And they might be the case. Of course, we all know that there are populist leaders that have authoritarian characteristics. But when you look at the discourses, the self-presentation of the leader always presents himself or herself as an outsider of politics, even when they are insiders, even when they have been governors for 20 years, like Nestor Kirchner. And they never present themselves as giving orders to the people. They always present themselves as being almost servants or being in a service to the people. But at the same time, they always tell the people, you need me, right? You cannot do this on your own. So you have this duality of the people and the leader. And again, I think I would be very shocked to find this discourse in Angela Merkel's discourses, for example. Although I believe, and just to finish this, that you see the diffusion of populist themes throughout the political spectrum today, and this goes back to our discussion yesterday or the day before, of what is the mainstream now. Is mainstream the sort of regular party technocratic politics, or is populism the mainstream now? And I think this speaks towards a sort of mainstreamification of populist tropes and traditions and myths, because it's quite frankly, it's become quite difficult to build a political identity if you do not use this type of language.
Yeah, Paris, please go ahead.
Maria, for the sake of debate, I'd like to insist on my argument that maybe what you're describing about Argentina is more of a partisan identity rather than a populist identity. First of all, as you also mentioned, there are many tensions within the Peronist party about, you know, what this myth is really about, right? There are left-wing Peronists, right-wing Peronists, there are regional leaders all over Argentina who have different views on, you know, how the party should present itself. And then we have the case of Carlos Menem, president for 10 years, right? Leader of the Peronist Party with a totally different myth, a very neoliberal myth, right? The myth there is actually the invisible hand, you know, the traditional myth of market liberalism. So how can we accept that there is a more or less consistent populist myth associated with the Peronists when it has, you know, it has swerved from left to right? Has the Menem myth has nothing to do with, you know, the Peronist foundations of a strong state, a strong welfare state, workers' rights, and so on and so forth. So I think the idea is more mixed, and what keeps Peronists together, as it does with other, you know, strong partisan identity, is that, you know, they hate the other guys, more or less.
But I never said anything about consistency. They are not consistent through time, and that is not a bug. That is a feature. So that is precisely what makes myths effective. And this is the first thing I had. There's the first thing that a Peronist politician will tell you is that they do not feel at all compelled to have any sort of consistency whatsoever. And this is, or now I'm going to modify what I've said. In Peronism, you have several myths that compete. And I think that is true of any established political party. And you can mix and match those myths. In fact, the very effective thing that the Kirchner did is that when they came out of power, they said, oh, you see the myth of Carlos Menem? We'll reject it completely. We're writing a new myth. And this is precisely why now we are entitled to become leaders of Peronism. And they did. And a lot of people criticizing them, saying, oh, you are changing the myths. And the question is just like, yes. So one of the issues that I think this sort of mythic language, one of the strengths of this mythic language is that it is not at all constrained by any need to show consistency. In fact, the lack of consistency is flaunted in public discourse. It's openly said that if we need to change the antagonism, then we change the antagonism, and that our former adversary can become our current ally. This is, let me tell you just, I'm sorry I bring so much example from the Argentine case. It's the case that I know more, that I've studied more. In 2009, Nestor Kirchner had his first heart attack. They have come from a very public conflict with the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, the Argentine Catholic Church, whose chief was at the time Jorge Bergoglio, was against the gay marriage law. And they had this public spat, and Bergoglio tried to go and visit Kirchner when he was in the hospital, and then the Kirchners basically kicked him out. And there was this huge show of being against one another. Then Bergoglio was chosen Pope, and then the first thing that the then president did was go to Rome and have a friendly chat with him. And then, for example, the president went to a couple of masses, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. And people were sort of shocked. And this was done with no feeling of having broken any boundary. It was just, the myth was re-articulated. And what I want to emphasize is that this is not a problem. This is not a bug, this is a feature. This is a thing that explains the resiliency of this type of movements. The interesting thing with Macri, for example, in my book, I think I show that Macri won by embodying the anti-populist myth, but once it won, it never changed the antagonism. And that was one of the reasons why not the only reason why he lost in 2019, that he was always locked in the same anti-Peronist, anti-populist discourse, where he should have moved towards another antagonism.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Maria. That's amazing. I think we're going to have to bring it to a close now. I was actually going to try and ask a question in which I kind of tried to forge an antagonism with the DM25 lot. Anyone that's please keen on them or have any hope for them. But we've got no time for that question now, because I gather this meeting will end at 2:30, kind of flat on the dot. So can I just say thank you very much for a really stimulating keynote, and we'll probably come back to some of the themes developed there, because I think your account really does capture so much about populism. It's really, really productive. So yeah, I suppose if people want to, we can hang around and chat for 5 minutes or so.